Hello, my friend. Tonight, we delve into a topic so steeped in secrecy and whispers, it's practically a ghost story for grown-ups. We're going to pull back the heavy velvet curtains of history and peer into the rarely discussed, often shocking, and sometimes downright bizarre, intimate lives of medieval queens. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit castle, the wind howling outside, and the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on stone walls. You're there, in the very heart of the royal court, and you're about to witness things that history books typically gloss over with a polite cough. This isn't your average fairy tale, and trust me, you probably won't survive this journey with your innocent notions of royalty entirely intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported, not just to a different time, but into a different kind of existence altogether. As a medieval queen, your body isn't truly your own. It's a vessel, a political instrument, and often a battleground. Your entire purpose, from the moment your marriage is arranged, often when you're little more than a child yourself, revolves around procreation, specifically around producing a male heir. No pressure, right? Just the stability of an entire kingdom resting on your ovaries. You might think of queens as these ethereal, untouchable figures, draped in silks and jewels, but beneath those layers of finery, they were women dealing with the same messy biological realities as anyone else, often under far more intense scrutiny. Consider your royal bedchamber. It's not a private sanctuary in the modern sense. Oh no, far from it. While it might be cordoned off by rich tapestries and guarded by stern-faced knights, privacy as you understand it simply doesn't exist. Your ladies-in-waiting are always present, dressing you, undressing you, tending to your every need. They know your secrets, your moods, and every ache and pain. Imagine having an audience for your nightly routine, every single night. Even on your wedding night, there would be witnesses, ensuring the consummation of the marriage. It was a formal, often public affair designed to solidify alliances and leave no room for doubt about the union. One mainstream historical fact you'll quickly grasp is that royal marriages were almost exclusively political alliances, not unions of love. Love, if it came at all, was a bonus, a happy accident, rarely the driving force. The pressure to conceive was immense, often leading to strange and desperate measures. Think about it. Your entire value as a queen hinged on your fertility. If you failed to produce an heir, your position could become precarious, your marriage annulled, or worse, you might be cast aside. Historians still argue whether the annulment of Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Louis VII of France was primarily due to political reasons or her failure to produce a male heir in their early years together. Either way, it highlights the stakes. You might hear whispers of peculiar fertility rituals, strange amulets worn close to the skin, or even the consumption of dubious elixirs. You'd be offered powders made from pulverized precious stones or brewed concoctions of herbs, all promising to make your womb fruitful. It's enough to make you long for a simple ibuprofen, isn't it? Just picturing some of those medieval cures makes me glad for modern medicine. You'd learn quickly that your body was not just a tool for producing heirs, it was also a commodity. The dowry you brought into the marriage was a crucial aspect of your worth, a testament to your family's power and wealth. It wasn't just about silks and jewels, but lands, castles, and substantial sums of money. This dowry in effect secured your position, but it also meant you were often seen as an extension of your family's assets. A quirky tidbit: some dowries included marriage portions of specific animals, like a certain number of sheep or horses, literally bringing livestock into the royal household as part of the queen's value. It makes you wonder if they had to stable the dowry in the castle courtyard. As a medieval queen, Your education, if you received one beyond basic literacy and religious instruction, was often geared towards managing a household and understanding courtly etiquette, not engaging in intellectual debates. Yet, you were expected to be a paragon of virtue, a model of piety, and, crucially, a fertile womb on legs. You would spend your days attending Mass, overseeing the sprawling castle household, which was essentially a small town in itself, and engaging in embroidery or other suitable feminine pursuits. But beneath the surface of this seemingly serene existence lay a constant, gnawing pressure. The pressure to produce an heir. This wasn't merely about personal desire, it was about dynastic survival. If you failed, the consequences could be dire, not just for you, but for the stability of the realm. A mainstream historical fact here is that the lack of a male heir was a constant source of anxiety for medieval monarchs, often leading to succession crises, wars, and even the downfall of dynasties. Think of the Wars of the Roses, for instance, a direct result of competing claims to the English throne. This immense pressure often led to some rather peculiar practices within the royal bedchamber. Forget romance, this was about conception. Every ache, every slight illness, every menstrual cycle was meticulously observed and discussed by your attendants. You'd find yourself subjected to a dizzying array of cures and enhancements to ensure fertility. These could range from bathing in certain herbal infusions to wearing specific amulets believed to possess procreative powers. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval texts suggest that women attempting to conceive would sleep with a piece of mandrake root under their pillow, or even consume small amounts of powdered unicorn horn, a truly expensive and mythical aphrodisiac, if you could even call it that. Can you imagine the taste? Probably like very old, chalky aspirin, if you were lucky. It makes you wonder how many unicorns went missing during this period. The very act of consummation, your conjugal duty, was often devoid of passion and treated with the gravity of a political negotiation. It was a contractual obligation. You might have been married to a man you'd never met before your wedding day, a man who spoke a different language, or a man significantly older or younger than you, and then you were expected to perform, so to speak. Historians still argue whether medieval queens, especially those married for political expediency, ever truly found personal satisfaction or even affection within these unions, or if it was simply a duty to be endured. There's no modern therapy to unpack that kind of emotional baggage, just more strange potions. The emphasis on fertility meant that menstrual cycles, often seen as mysterious and even slightly dangerous in medieval times, were closely monitored. There was a strong belief that the moon's phases influenced a woman's fertility, and certain astrological alignments were considered more propitious for conception. You might be advised to engage in intimacy only during specific phases of the moon, or after consuming certain warming foods thought to encourage conception. It truly was a scientific endeavor, just, based on completely different science. It really puts a new spin on moonlighting, doesn't it? And if conception didn't happen quickly enough, the whispers would start. Was the queen barren? Was the king impotent? Accusations could fly, and desperation could lead to even more extreme measures. Pilgrimages to holy sites, known for fertility miracles, vows made to saints, even public prayers for a royal heir became common. Your body, your most intimate self, was not yours to control. It was a resource of the state, scrutinized and poked and prodded for the greater good of the kingdom. It's hard to imagine the psychological toll of that kind of perpetual performance. The financial underpinnings of your royal marriage, the mighty dowry, were far more than just a bridal gift. They were a binding contract, a demonstration of your family's power, and a critical safeguard for your future. You weren't just bringing yourself to the marriage, you were bringing a significant portion of your family's wealth, land, and influence. Imagine it as a medieval prenuptial agreement, but with far higher stakes and usually no way out. This dowry would often revert to your family if the marriage was annulled without an heir, or if you died without issue, making it a constant point of negotiation and often contention. A mainstream historical fact is that the size and value of a queen's dowry could dictate her standing at court and her influence over her husband and his advisors. A richer dowry often meant more political leverage. This financial arrangement wasn't just about grand sums of money or vast tracts of land. Sometimes it involved less conventional assets. A quirky tidbit. Some dowries included the rights to specific taxes or tolls from particular regions, meaning your financial security, and by extension your status, was literally tied to the economic output of distant villages. You might technically own the right to collect tolls on a bridge in a province you'd never even seen. It's like being gifted a percentage of future parking ticket revenue from a city you've only heard about in dispatches. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperated tax collectors. The dowry also served as a form of security for you, the queen. Should your husband die, leaving you a widow, your dower lands, a portion of his estates granted to you for your lifetime, would often be secured by the dowry you brought into the marriage. This was essential, as a medieval widow, even a royal one, could find herself in a precarious position without independent means. Historians still argue whether the wealth and lands a queen held through her dowry and dower truly gave her significant independent political power, or if it was primarily a symbolic measure of her family's standing. While you might control vast lands on paper, the practical administration often remained in the hands of the king's men, or your sons, once he came of age. Think about the implications of this constant financial tether. Every aspect of your life, from the lavishness of your wardrobe to the size of your retinue, could be influenced by the wealth you brought to the union. It meant that even your most intimate acts, like conceiving an heir, had a direct economic consequence. A successful pregnancy secured the dowry and dower for your children, solidifying your lineage's future. A failure, however, could jeopardize everything, potentially leading to your being sent back to your family, dowry in tow, a public symbol of dynastic failure. The economic pressure was just as intense as the biological one. You lived in a world where everything had a price, and often that price was paid in political capital and the promise of future generations. Your worth as a woman was inextricably linked to your capacity to produce and to the economic might of your family. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That your body, your destiny, and even your potential for happiness could be so meticulously calculated and weighed on the scales of dynastic finance. The weight of the crown you wore wasn't just physical. It was an immense burden of expectation, specifically the expectation of fertility's heavy crown. From the moment you were wed, often in a grand ceremony designed to display power and wealth, your primary role shifted from a daughter of a noble house to the potential mother of the next king or queen. This wasn't merely a hope, it was a non-negotiable duty. Every missed menstrual cycle, every slight queasiness, every fleeting ailment would be scrutinized by a host of ladies-in-waiting, physicians, and even distant relatives hoping for news of a swelling belly. A mainstream historical fact is that dynastic continuity was paramount in medieval monarchies, and the failure to produce a legitimate male heir often plunged kingdoms into succession crises, civil wars, or annexation by ambitious neighbours. The very future of your realm rested, quite literally, within your womb. Imagine the psychological pressure. You, a young woman, perhaps barely out of childhood yourself, were suddenly thrust into a role where your personal biology dictated the fate of nations. If you were barren, or only bore daughters, your position became precarious. Whispers of annulment, accusations of witchcraft, or even the possibility of being sent to a convent could become very real threats. A quirky tidbit from the period is the practice of touching for the king's evil, scrofula, where monarchs were believed to have a divine ability to heal through touch. Conversely, a queen's ability to produce an heir was often seen as a sign of divine favour, or lack thereof, a mark of God's blessing or displeasure. It's almost as if you were a walking, talking barometer of divine will, which certainly adds a layer of stress to your morning routine. This intense focus on fertility led to all manner of desperate measures and peculiar practices. You might be forced to endure elaborate and often uncomfortable rituals designed to encourage conception. These could include wearing specially blessed garments, drinking concoctions of dubious origin, or undergoing physical manipulations by midwives. Historians still argue whether the belief in various fertility charms or potions was genuine medical practice of the time, or primarily a reflection of the profound anxieties surrounding royal succession. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a blend of nascent medical understanding and deep-seated superstition. You would be constantly reminded of your purpose. Your ladies-in-waiting, many of whom were chosen for their experience in childbirth and child-rearing, would share their wisdom, often unsolicited, on everything from diet to sexual positions believed to enhance fertility. The court physicians, usually men, would offer their own theories, often based on ancient Greek or Roman humoral theories of the body, which could lead to treatments that, by modern standards, seem utterly absurd or even dangerous. One common belief was that a woman needed to achieve sexual pleasure to conceive, a concept that often put undue pressure on the queen during intimate moments, not to mention her husband. It makes you wonder if they had a performance review for that. And the moment a pregnancy was confirmed, a new set of rituals and restrictions would begin. Special diets, limited physical activity, and increased prayers for a healthy birth would become your daily routine. The joy of potential motherhood was inextricably linked with the immense fear of miscarriage, stillbirth, or the birth of a sickly child. Your body, once merely a vessel for an heir, now became a fragile temple, needing constant vigilance and protection. Given the immense pressure to produce an heir, it's hardly surprising that medieval queens and their courts turned to all manner of substances believed to ignite passion and, more importantly, enhance royal desire and fertility. You'd find yourself in a world where the line between medicine, magic, and sheer desperation was incredibly blurred. These weren't just about making things fun in the bedchamber. They were seen as vital tools in the dynastic game. A mainstream historical fact is that throughout the Middle Ages, belief in the efficacy of various herbs, minerals, and animal parts as aphrodisiacs or fertility aids was widespread, not just among the common folk but in the highest echelons of society. Imagine being presented with a peculiar concoction, perhaps a wine infused with exotic spices, or a dish prepared with ingredients you'd never encountered before. You might be told it would warm the humours or stimulate the vital spirits necessary for conception. A quirky tidbit: one suggested aphrodisiac from medieval texts was a drink made from sparrow brains, due to the bird's reputation for promiscuity. Yes, you heard that right. Sparrow brains. It makes you wonder if they had a dedicated royal sparrow catcher, and if the king ever noticed a sudden increase in feathered friends around the castle. Darling, is that bird seed in your teeth? Beyond such questionable culinary delights, you'd encounter various herbs, often gathered under specific astrological alignments, and thought to possess powerful properties. Mandrake root, as mentioned before, was not just for sleeping under your pillow. It was sometimes ground into a powder or infused in wine. Other popular choices included ginger, cinnamon, and even ground-up pearls, all believed to have properties that could stir the body and encourage conception. Historians still argue whether the consistent use of such substances had any physiological effect, or if their power was purely psychological, a potent placebo effect driven by belief and desperate hope. Perhaps the most effective ingredient was simply the belief that they would work. You would also be privy to a more intimate form of aphrodisiac, personal rituals, and even advice on sexual positions believed to be most conducive to conception. While modesty was paramount in public, in the privacy, or semi-privacy, of your bedchamber, the practicalities of procreation would be openly discussed. Midwives and experienced ladies-in-waiting, often older and more pragmatic, would offer guidance, sometimes surprisingly explicit, on how to best fulfill your conjugal duties for the purpose of conceiving. It wasn't about pleasure, remember, but production. The sheer variety of these proposed solutions speaks volumes about the constant anxiety surrounding royal fertility. From the rare and expensive, like powdered gemstones, to the mundane and slightly disgusting, like certain animal organs, no stone, or sparrow brain, was left unturned in the quest for an heir. It paints a picture of queens who were, in many ways, experimental subjects in a never-ending quest for fertility, hoping against hope that the next strange brew or peculiar ritual would finally deliver the longed-for prince. It's enough to make you grateful for modern dating apps and Netflix binges, isn't it? Much less pressure than sparrow brain cocktails. As a medieval queen, your marriage was less a partnership of equals and more a strategic alliance, with your body serving as the ultimate political tool. The concept of conjugal duty wasn't merely a suggestion. It was a fundamental obligation, intricately woven into the very fabric of your existence. This duty extended beyond simply being present in the same bedchamber. It encompassed the solemn expectation of sexual intimacy for the sole purpose of procreation. A mainstream historical fact is that the consummation of a royal marriage was often a highly formalized, sometimes even witnessed, event, crucial for validating the union and ensuring the legitimacy of any future heirs. There was no room for ambiguity when it came to the royal lineage. Imagine the pressure on your wedding night. After a day of elaborate ceremonies, feasts, and public display, you'd be escorted to your bedchamber, often by an assembly of nobles and church officials. They would witness your preparation for bed, and in some cases, even remain until the sheets were ceremoniously pulled back the next morning to confirm the act had taken place. This wasn't about romance. It was about public proof and dynastic security. It's certainly a unique way to start a marriage, isn't it? Makes a modern wedding night seem positively private by comparison. This duty wasn't limited to the initial consummation. The expectation of regular intimacy continued throughout your childbearing years. Every act of union was, in essence, a roll of the dice for the kingdom's future. If you didn't conceive quickly enough, the whispers would start, and the pressure would mount. You'd find yourself subjected to increasingly intrusive advice and interventions, all aimed at ensuring you fulfilled your biological imperative. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts suggested that certain sexual positions were more effective for conception, and royal couples might even be advised by their physicians on the optimal way to fulfill their conjugal duties. It sounds less like intimacy and more like a very high-stakes gymnastic routine for two. Historians still argue whether medieval queens, particularly those in arranged marriages, ever truly experienced genuine affection or desire for their royal spouses, or if the act was merely a necessary, often emotionally detached, part of their queenly role. It's hard to imagine forging a deep connection when your most private moments are under such intense scrutiny and burdened by immense national expectations. There's no escaping the political implications, even in the bedroom. And what if the king was, shall we say, less than appealing? Perhaps he was significantly older, or had a disagreeable temperament, or suffered from some physical affliction. Your duty remained absolute. There was no recourse, no escape from this fundamental aspect of your role. Your personal feelings were secondary to the needs of the realm. The bedchamber, far from being a place of intimate connection, could often feel like another courtly arena, fraught with the same political pressures and expectations as the throne room itself. It was a stark reminder that even as a queen, you were, in many ways, a pawn in a much larger game. Even within the rigid confines of medieval royalty, where marriage was a political contract and heirs were paramount, the messy reality of human desire often found its way into the court, leading to the complex world of mistresses and royal scandals. While your primary role as queen was to provide legitimate heirs, your husband, the king, was rarely held to the same strict standards of fidelity. In fact, royal mistresses were often an open secret, sometimes even holding official, albeit unofficial, positions within the court. A mainstream historical fact is that many medieval kings openly kept mistresses, and in some cases, these relationships produced illegitimate children who, while usually unable to inherit the throne, could still wield considerable influence and were often acknowledged and provided for by their royal fathers. Imagine the tightrope you, as queen, would have to walk. You were expected to embody purity and virtue, while your husband might be openly flaunting his dalliances. The presence of a mistress could be a source of profound personal humiliation, but publicly, you were often expected to tolerate it, even feign ignorance. To challenge the king too openly could be seen as an act of defiance, potentially jeopardizing your own position, especially if you hadn't yet produced a male heir. A quirky tidbit: some royal mistresses, particularly those who were well-born or politically astute, could even become powerful figures in their own right, influencing royal policy and acting as intermediaries between the king and various factions. It's a strange paradox where an extramarital relationship could sometimes be a conduit for political power, almost like a shadow queen. The reactions to these relationships varied greatly. Some queens, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, were known for their strong personalities and would not tolerate open infidelity, though even her influence had its limits. Others might have resigned themselves to their fate, focusing on their children and their own power base within the court. Historians still argue whether the presence of royal mistresses was seen as a purely personal failing of the king, or if it was simply an accepted part of aristocratic male behaviour, with queens expected to implicitly understand and manage the situation. Perhaps it was viewed as an unfortunate but inevitable byproduct of kingship, a slight detour from the royal highway. Scandals, however, were another matter. While a long-standing mistress might be tolerated, overt public displays of affection, favouritism that threatened legitimate heirs, or any perceived slight to the queen's honour could ignite courtly gossip and even political unrest. You might hear whispers of a king lavishing gifts on a mistress that should have gone to you or your children, or of a mistress attempting to influence the succession. These weren't just personal dramas. They had real political ramifications. And what about your own desires? As a queen, you were under constant surveillance. Any hint of infidelity on your part would be met with swift and brutal consequences, ranging from imprisonment to execution. The double standard was stark and unforgiving. Your body was for the realm, for the legitimate heir. His body, it seemed, was for whatever he pleased, as long as the primary duty of procreation was met. It really wasn't a fair game, was it? You had to be the perfect, pious, fertile icon, while he could basically live out his own medieval rock star fantasy, albeit with more ermine and less pyrotechnics. Living as a medieval queen meant that your health, particularly your reproductive health, was a matter of public concern, constantly monitored by court physicians who relied on often bizarre and unproven methods. You'd find yourself subjected to a parade of the Queen's medical secrets, where privacy was non-existent and peculiar remedies were the norm. Mainstream historical fact shows that medieval medicine was a blend of ancient Greek and Roman theories, like humoral theory, which balanced bodily fluids, astrological beliefs, and a hefty dose of superstition, making many treatments seem strange to modern eyes. Imagine complaining of a simple headache. You might be prescribed a poultice of crushed herbs applied to your temples, or even have a small amount of blood drawn to rebalance your humours. Now, consider something more intimate, like difficulty conceiving or issues related to menstruation. The treatments could become even more invasive and strange. You might be asked to ingest concoctions made from animal parts, or to wear amulets believed to draw out ailments or promote fertility. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts suggested that to regulate a woman's cycle, she might be advised to carry specific stones on her person, or even to apply a mixture containing the ashes of a burned toad directly to her abdomen. It's enough to make you truly appreciate a simple, over-the-counter pain reliever, isn't it? One can only imagine the sheer willpower required to swallow some of those cures. The physicians themselves, often learned men of their time, operated within a framework of knowledge that was severely limited compared to today. They believed that the womb was a wandering organ that could move within the body, causing various ailments if it wasn't properly seated. Historians still argue whether the medical advice given to medieval queens, particularly regarding conception and childbirth, was more harmful than helpful, given the limited understanding of anatomy and hygiene. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That the very people trying to help you might inadvertently be causing more harm with their well-intentioned but often misguided treatments. You would also have been at the mercy of practices surrounding pregnancy and childbirth that were incredibly perilous. Miscarriage was common, and childbirth itself was a leading cause of death for women, even queens. To ensure a safe delivery, you might be surrounded by religious relics, have prayers recited continuously, and even have specific charms placed on your bed. The air would be thick with incense and the murmurs of supplication, all aimed at a successful outcome. And if you faced problems related to your feminine cycles, as they were vaguely referred to, the remedies were equally unusual. From consuming bitter herbal teas to undergoing hot baths infused with aromatic plants, every effort was made to regulate your body according to the prevailing medical wisdom. It was a constant barrage of interventions, a perpetual focus on your physical state, always with the underlying purpose of ensuring your capability to produce and sustain life for the kingdom. You were, in essence, a high-value biological asset, and your health was managed with all the strange tools available to the medieval medical mind. It's enough to make you want to send them a copy of a modern anatomy textbook. The quest for a royal heir was so paramount that it often led medieval queens and their courts to engage in elaborate and sometimes truly bizarre rituals for conception. These weren't just personal prayers, they were often public, communal, or intensely private acts, all designed to invoke divine favour or harness mystical energies to ensure a pregnancy. A mainstream historical fact is that pilgrimages to shrines renowned for fertility miracles were common among medieval nobility, and queens were no exception, often making solemn vows or sending elaborate gifts in hopes of divine intervention. Imagine the pressure building after months, or even years, without a confirmed pregnancy. The whispers would grow louder, the court would become more anxious, and new experts would emerge with their own unique suggestions. You might find yourself participating in elaborate church ceremonies, where priests would offer special blessings over your person, or over the royal bedchamber itself. A quirky tidbit: some medieval queens were advised to touch or even wear the relics of saints known for their miraculous ability to aid childbearing, such as the girdle of the Virgin Mary or the bones of Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth. It's like having a lucky charm, but one that might require a whole procession to move it into your private chambers. You can just picture the logistics. Mind the relics tonight. It's crucial for the future of the kingdom. Beyond the overtly religious, there were also more esoteric practices. Some traditions involve specific bathing rituals, often in waters believed to be sacred or possessing special mineral properties, thought to enhance fertility. You might be advised to sleep with particular plants or symbols under your bed, or to consume certain foods believed to be hot or cold in nature, to balance your internal humours and create an optimal environment for conception. Historians still argue whether these rituals were purely superstitious, providing psychological comfort, or if some, by sheer chance or psychosomatic effect, occasionally seemed to yield results, thus perpetuating belief in their efficacy. It's a fascinating blend of faith, folk medicine, and wishful thinking. You might also find yourself participating in symbolic acts. For example, some accounts suggest rituals where barren women, including queens, would enact mock pregnancies or births, hoping to trick nature into following suit. Or perhaps you would be given fertility dolls, effigies that were cared for as if they were real infants, as a form of sympathetic magic. The sheer variety of these practices speaks to the deep-seated human desire for control over reproduction, even when faced with the vast unknowns of biology. The culmination of these rituals was always the hope of a successful pregnancy and eventually the birth of a healthy heir. Every prayer, every strange concoction, every symbolic act was a desperate plea to the universe to grant the most coveted gift a queen could receive, the confirmation of her worth through the promise of a successor. It paints a picture of intense longing and vulnerability, masked by the regal facade. Your life as a medieval queen was profoundly shaped by the intricate web of marriage alliances explored across the continent. These unions were rarely about personal affection. They were meticulously calculated strategic moves on a vast geopolitical chessboard. You were a living, breathing treaty, a bond forged between kingdoms to secure peace, consolidate power, or extend influence. A mainstream historical fact is that dynastic marriages were the primary tool of diplomacy in medieval Europe, often preventing wars or cementing newly formed political relationships. You were, in essence, a high-stakes bargaining chip. Imagine the negotiations that would have taken place before you were even old enough to understand them. Your hand in marriage would be debated by kings, dukes, and powerful advisors, often based on your family's landholdings, military strength, and the legitimacy of your lineage. You might be pledged to a future husband decades before the wedding, sometimes to a man you'd never seen, from a country whose language you barely understood. It's like being drafted into a very specific kind of international service without ever having a say in your deployment. Congratulations, you've been assigned to France. This meant your personal desires, your hopes, your affections were entirely secondary to the needs of the state. You were expected to embrace your new identity, adapt to a foreign court, and, most importantly, fulfill your primary duty, to produce heirs who would solidify the alliance. A quirky tidbit: some marriage contracts explicitly stipulated the number of male children expected, or even included clauses about what would happen if the queen failed to produce an heir within a certain time frame, often leading to a threat of annulment. It was less a marriage proposal and more a performance contract, with incredibly high penalties for non-delivery. Historians still argue whether these purely political unions ever truly fostered genuine affection between royal spouses, or if the relationships remained largely formal and duty-bound. While some couples certainly found love and companionship, it was often the exception rather than the rule. You might find a kind husband, a cruel one, or merely an indifferent one. Your fate was sealed by the political machinations of others. Your role was to make the best of it, to exert influence where you could, and to maintain your dignity. The pressure of these alliances extended beyond the wedding day. Every potential pregnancy, every birth, and every child's survival became a matter of international importance. Your fertility was not just a personal matter but a crucial element of the alliance's success. If you produced a healthy male heir, the alliance was strengthened. If you did not, the delicate balance could shift, potentially leading to renewed tensions or even war between the very families your marriage was supposed to unite. So, you lived your life knowing that your body was not just your own, but a symbol of a treaty, a vessel for an alliance. It was a heavy burden, a life lived under constant scrutiny, where your most intimate moments had profound political ramifications. It certainly makes you appreciate the relative simplicity of choosing your own partner, doesn't it? No global politics, just deciding who gets to pick the Netflix show. In an age where marriage and procreation were the ultimate royal duties, the concept of celibacy's royal burden might seem utterly contradictory for a medieval queen. Yet, for some, this became their unexpected, often unwanted fate. While most queens were destined for the marriage bed, a rare few found themselves in circumstances that led to a life devoid of marital intimacy. A mainstream historical fact is that noble women who failed to secure a politically advantageous marriage, or those widowed young without heirs, sometimes entered convents, embracing a life of religious devotion and celibacy as an alternative to a precarious secular existence. Imagine being a young princess, raised with the expectation of a grand marriage. only to find yourself deemed unsuitable by potential suitors for political reasons, or perhaps due to a physical infirmity. Or perhaps your intended groom died before the marriage could be consummated, leaving you in a difficult, liminal state. For you, the convent might beckon not as a calling, but as a practical solution. It offered a degree of safety and intellectual pursuit that might otherwise be unavailable to an unmarried noblewoman, but at the cost of your expected destiny. A quirky tidbit. Some women who took vows of celibacy within a convent still held considerable power, managing vast estates and influencing local politics, effectively becoming spiritual queens in their own right, though their power was rarely dynastic. It's a fascinating twist on the concept of female influence. Historians still argue whether women who entered convents due to these circumstances truly found spiritual fulfillment, or if it was primarily a pragmatic choice, a way to navigate a society that offered limited options for unmarried noblewomen. While some undoubtedly embraced their religious calling with fervour, for others, it might have been a quiet form of exile, a life defined by absence rather than presence. You might have yearned for the children you would never bear, or the consort you would never know. Even for queens who were married, a form of enforced celibacy could occur. If a king was incapacitated by illness or injury, or perhaps chose to pursue a deeply religious life that eschewed physical intimacy, his queen might find herself in a celibate marriage. While her primary duty to produce an heir would remain unfulfilled, the political complexities would often prevent an annulment, leaving her in a marital limbo. This could lead to intense frustration and sometimes desperate measures to secure a successor by other means, though such acts were incredibly risky. So, while the image of a medieval queen is almost invariably tied to fertility and lineage, for a select few, the path diverged. Their bodies, instead of being instruments of dynastic continuation, became vessels for spiritual devotion or symbols of an unfulfilled destiny. It was a life of quiet sacrifice, often overlooked in the grand narratives of kings and battles, but no less profound in its personal implications. It makes you think about how different happily ever after could look, doesn't it? Sometimes it wasn't about the prince, but about a prayer book. While the loss of a husband would undoubtedly be a period of profound grief and uncertainty for any medieval woman, for a queen, widowhood's new freedoms could sometimes offer an unexpected, albeit limited, degree of autonomy. Gone were the immediate pressures of conjugal duty and the constant scrutiny over fertility, replaced by a unique, sometimes powerful, position within the royal hierarchy. A mainstream historical fact is that dowager queens, especially those who are mothers of the reigning monarch, often retain significant wealth, dower lands, and political influence, becoming powerful figures in their own right. Imagine yourself, now a queen dowager. The black mourning clothes might cling to you, but beneath them, a different kind of power might stir. You would no longer be subject to your husband's direct command, and if your son was on the throne, your counsel would often be sought, and your wisdom respected. You might control your own lands and revenues, managing your own household, and dispensing patronage. This newfound independence, while still circumscribed by societal expectations and your son's authority, was a stark contrast to your earlier life as a young queen beholden to her husband's will. A quirky tidbit: some dowager queens even embarked on significant building projects, patronized the arts, or founded religious institutions, leaving a lasting legacy that extended beyond their role as wives and mothers. It's almost as if, once the immediate pressure of producing heirs was off, they finally had a bit of creative energy to spare. Historians still argue whether the increased independence of dowager queens was a genuine step towards female empowerment in the medieval period, or simply a temporary, often fragile, power base dependent on the goodwill of their male relatives. While you might wield influence, it was rarely absolute, and could be revoked if you were seen to overstep your bounds or interfere too much in the current king's reign. Your political power was often exercised behind the scenes, through persuasion and alliances rather than direct command. For some, widowhood also meant a release from the expectations of further procreation. If you had successfully produced a male heir who was now king, your primary dynastic duty was fulfilled. You might choose to retire to a dower castle, dedicating yourself to prayer, charity, or the upbringing of your younger children, free from the intimate pressures of the royal bedchamber. The constant demand to conceive, to endure perilous childbirths, would finally be lifted. However, freedom wasn't absolute. If you were a young widow without male heirs, or if your son was still a minor, you might find yourself a pawn in new political games, potentially forced into another strategic marriage. Your body, even in widowhood, could still be seen as a valuable asset for forming new alliances. But for many, especially those who had secured the succession, widowhood offered a chance to redefine their purpose, to become a matriarch of considerable standing, guiding the dynasty from a position of experience rather than expectation. It's a subtle shift, but a significant one, offering a quiet, dignified power that was perhaps more personally fulfilling than the relentless demands of the earlier years. For a medieval queen, the act of childbirth's perilous ordeal was arguably the most dangerous and intensely scrutinized event of her adult life. More than battles or political intrigue, the birthing chamber was where your life and the future of the kingdom truly hung in the balance. It was a terrifying, painful, and often deadly experience, surrounded by more superstition and ritual than medical knowledge. A mainstream historical fact is that maternal mortality rates were extraordinarily high throughout the medieval period, making each successful royal birth a cause for immense celebration and relief. Imagine the atmosphere as your time drew near. The tension in the castle would be palpable. Your personal chamber would be transformed into a special birthing room, known as the lying-in chamber, often draped with tapestries to block out drafts and filled with the scents of herbs believed to ease labour or ward off evil spirits. Access would be restricted, primarily to experienced midwives, a few trusted ladies-in-waiting, and perhaps a confessor. Men, including the king, were typically excluded, reflecting the largely female-dominated practice of childbirth at the time. A quirky tidbit: to aid in a difficult labour, some medieval practices involved placing sacred relics, particularly those associated with the Virgin Mary or other female saints, directly on the Queen's body or in the room. You might have found yourself clutching a saint's bone or wearing a blessed girdle, desperate for any comfort or miraculous intervention. It's a bit like having a very intense, spiritual good luck charm for the most important event of your life. The labour itself could last for days, and the pain would be excruciating, with no effective pain relief available beyond perhaps herbal teas or a prayer. You would be encouraged to walk, to sit in birthing chairs, or to assume various positions to aid the delivery, guided by the experienced hands of the midwife. Historians still argue whether the medical interventions available at the time, such as crude surgical tools or the use of specific herbal remedies, did more to alleviate suffering or inadvertently caused further complications. The line between help and harm was incredibly thin. Every breath you took, every groan you uttered, was heard by those around you, all waiting with bated breath for the cry of a newborn, hoping desperately for a son. The relief when a child finally emerged would be immense, often followed by a collective sigh of prayer for its survival and your own. The immediate post-birth rituals were just as critical, from swaddling the infant to performing a hurried baptism if the child seemed frail, to ensuring your own recovery, which was far from guaranteed. The constant fear of infection, hemorrhage, or eclampsia loomed large over every birth. Many queens died in childbirth, a tragic cost of their dynastic duty. Each successful delivery, therefore, was not just a personal triumph, but a major political event, cementing alliances and securing the future of the kingdom. It was a brutal reminder that even at the pinnacle of power, your body was susceptible to the most fundamental and dangerous of human experiences. It really makes you appreciate epidurals, doesn't it? And perhaps a quiet, private hospital room, far from the watchful eyes of the entire court. You might imagine medieval queens living in pristine, fragrant environments, but the reality of royal bathing, peculiarities, and hygiene practices was far removed from modern standards. Personal cleanliness, especially frequent full-body bathing, was not prioritized in the same way it is today, often due to a combination of practical limitations, prevailing medical theories, and cultural norms. A mainstream historical fact is that daily full immersion bathing, as we understand it, was uncommon for all but the very wealthy, and even then, it was more of a luxury than a regular necessity. Imagine your royal bath. It wouldn't be a quick shower or a warm soak every day. Instead, it was likely an elaborate occasional affair. Large wooden tubs would have to be brought in, filled manually with buckets of heated water, a laborious process. You might bathe in scented waters, infused with herbs like lavender or rose petals, or even wine, believed to be good for the skin. These baths were often more for medicinal or ceremonial purposes than for simple cleanliness. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval medical theories actually warned against frequent bathing, believing that hot water opened the pores and made the body more susceptible to disease, particularly during times of plague. So, your royal physician might actually discourage too much scrubbing, which I suppose is one less thing to worry about, though perhaps not ideal for keeping fresh. Instead of daily baths, you would rely more on partial washing. Basins of water would be brought for washing hands and face, and perhaps a quick wipe down of other areas with damp cloths. Perfumes and heavily scented oils were used to mask body odor, rather than eliminate it. Your undergarments, typically linen, would be changed regularly, as they were believed to absorb bodily impurities, and these were frequently laundered. Historians still argue whether the less frequent bathing practices genuinely contributed to higher rates of disease, or if other factors like poor sanitation, contaminated water, and limited medical knowledge were far more significant. It's hard to isolate one factor in a complex medieval ecosystem. The social aspect of bathing also differed. While not common for the Queen herself, communal public baths existed in some areas, and certainly in Roman times, but by the medieval period, they had largely fallen out of favour, sometimes associated with moral laxity. Your personal hygiene, therefore, was largely a private, or semi-private given the constant presence of ladies-in-waiting, affair dictated by available resources and current beliefs. Your hair, too, would be treated differently. It would be brushed, braided and covered, especially in public, to signify modesty and status. Washing hair was an even rarer event than body bathing, relying more on dry cleaning techniques and the use of powders to absorb oils. So, while you might wear silks and jewels, beneath the surface, the standards of freshness were quite different from what you experience today. It certainly makes you appreciate modern plumbing and the sheer abundance of hot water, doesn't it? No need for sparrow brains or worrying about open pores, just a nice, long, guilt-free shower. In a world driven by dynastic imperatives and strict social codes, the human heart still found ways to express its unruly desires, often resorting to the arcane arts of love potions and charms. For medieval queens, caught between political obligation and personal yearning, these mystical aids offered a seductive, if often dangerous, promise of control over affection. A mainstream historical fact is that belief in magical remedies and spells, including those for love, was widespread across all social strata in medieval Europe, from peasant cottages to royal courts. Imagine your life as a queen, potentially married to a man you neither loved nor desired, yet bound by duty to bear his children. The loneliness could be immense, the lack of genuine connection profound. In such a situation, the whispers of a courtier, a lady-in-waiting, or a visiting wise woman about a potent love charm might pique your interest. These weren't necessarily about forcing someone against their will, but rather about encouraging affection, drawing out latent fondness, or simply ensuring faithfulness. A quirky tidbit. One common ingredient in medieval love potions was a small piece of mandrake root, often shaped into a human figure, believed to possess powerful magical properties, as we mentioned earlier for fertility. It's like having a little magical doll you hoped would make your husband think you were the best thing since sliced bread, or at least since medieval stew. You might be advised to slip a specific herb into your husband's drink, or to wear an amulet enchanted to make you more appealing. Some charms involved writing names on parchment and burying them, or performing rituals under the light of a new moon. Historians still argue whether the belief in these charms was a form of psychological coping mechanism for women with little agency, or if there was a genuine, albeit misguided, conviction in their supernatural efficacy. Perhaps it was simply a desperate measure born of profound longing. The risks, however, were considerable. If discovered, dabbling in magic could lead to accusations of witchcraft, a charge that carried severe penalties, including execution. Your reputation, painstakingly built on piety and virtue, could be shattered in an instant. Therefore, any recourse to such charms would have been done in the utmost secrecy, often with the complicity of trusted servants. These charms weren't always about securing a husband's love. Sometimes they were used by others to gain influence over the queen or king, adding another layer of intrigue and danger to court life. A jealous rival might attempt to curse a queen, or an ambitious courtier might try to ensnare the king's affections. The court was a hotbed of paranoia and suspicion, and any unusual behavior could be attributed to magical interference. So, while your public life was one of rigid adherence to religious and social norms, your private thoughts might have occasionally strayed to the forbidden arts, seeking a magical solution to the heart's dilemmas. It's a poignant reminder that even queens, surrounded by luxury and power, could feel utterly powerless over matters of the heart, leading them to grasp at any hope, however unorthodox. It certainly makes you grateful for modern relationship advice, even if it sometimes feels like witchcraft itself. In a society obsessed with lineage and the need for legitimate heirs, it might seem paradoxical that medieval queens, or those around them, would ever consider contraception's dark arts. Yet, whispers and practices existed, often crude and dangerous, aimed at preventing unwanted pregnancies. These were rarely about empowering women with reproductive choice in the modern sense. More often, they were desperate measures taken in specific, often perilous, circumstances. A mainstream historical fact is that knowledge of herbal abortifacients and contraceptive methods, however rudimentary, has existed in various forms across many ancient and medieval cultures, though their effectiveness and safety were highly questionable. Imagine a queen who, after bearing several children, perhaps even a male heir, finds herself weakened by repeated childbirths, or whose political situation makes another pregnancy undesirable. Or perhaps a young, unmarried noblewoman who, through a clandestine affair, finds herself in a terrifying predicament. In such dire circumstances, the forbidden knowledge of preventing conception, or even ending a pregnancy, might be sought out in the darkest corners of the court. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval texts mention magical amulets worn to ward off conception, often containing specific herbs or even small animal bones, highlighting the blend of medical theory and superstition in these practices. It's like a medieval birth control bracelet, though probably far less effective and definitely not stylish. The methods described in historical texts or hinted at in folklore were often perilous. These could include consuming various bitter or caustic herbal concoctions, often with severe side effects and little proven efficacy. Some involved physical practices, like prolonged abstinence, or even attempts at creating physical barriers, though these were rudimentary and highly unreliable. Historians still argue whether the primary intent of these practices was true contraception, preventing conception, or early abortifacients, inducing miscarriage, as the distinction was often blurred in medieval understanding. The risks involved were immense, often leading to illness, sterility, or even death for the woman. You would have been keenly aware of these dangers. For a queen, the political ramifications of preventing a pregnancy, particularly before securing a male heir, would be catastrophic if discovered. It could lead to accusations of treason, sorcery, or a deliberate attempt to undermine the dynasty. Therefore, any such act would be cloaked in absolute secrecy, known only to the woman and perhaps a single, most trusted confidant or servant. The societal pressure to procreate meant that any attempt to thwart nature's course was seen as morally reprehensible and divinely offensive. These were truly dark arts, not just in their often gruesome methods, but in the profound societal condemnation they would incur if brought to light. It paints a stark picture of the limited agency women, even queens, had over their own bodies, driven to desperate measures by circumstance and the unforgiving expectations of their time. It makes you feel very grateful for modern reproductive healthcare, doesn't it? No need for dubious potions or, heaven forbid, anything involving animal bones. While medieval marriages, especially royal ones, were typically considered divinely sanctioned and indissoluble, the realities of politics and dynastic necessity sometimes led to dramatic divorce and annulment battles. For a medieval queen, facing the dissolution of her marriage was a terrifying prospect, a public humiliation that could strip her of status, power, and even her children. A mainstream historical fact is that true divorce, in the modern sense, was virtually impossible under canon law in medieval Europe. What occurred were usually annulments, which declared the marriage null and void from the beginning, often on grounds of consanguinity, blood relation, or non-consummation. Imagine being the subject of such a proceeding. Your entire life, your very legitimacy as queen, would be meticulously scrutinized by church courts and political advisors. Every detail of your marriage, even the most intimate, would become fodder for legal arguments. You might find yourself accused of barrenness, of having prior vows, or of being related to your husband within prohibited degrees, sometimes a lineage discovered only when a convenient excuse for annulment was needed. A quirky tidbit, one of the most common and sometimes manufactured grounds for annulment, was discovering that the couple were distantly related, even if that relation was incredibly tenuous and required tracing genealogies back several generations. It's almost as if suddenly everyone became an amateur genealogist when a king needed a new wife. Oh dear, it seems your great-great-great-grand-aunt once waved at my great-great-grand-uncle. This marriage is clearly invalid. The process was long, arduous, and intensely public. You would be expected to defend yourself, often through proxies, against accusations that could ruin your reputation. The stakes were incredibly high. If the annulment was granted, you would typically lose your title as queen. Your dowry might be returned to your family, or sometimes forfeited, and your children could be declared illegitimate, impacting their claim to the throne. Historians still argue whether the grounds for annulment were truly discovered legal impediments, or if they were largely pretexts manufactured to serve political ends, allowing powerful monarchs to discard inconvenient wives without incurring the wrath of the church or their noble allies. It was a legal dance, often choreographed by political necessity. The most famous example, of course, is Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, which ultimately led to the English Reformation. While this was later in the medieval period's twilight, it perfectly illustrates the lengths to which monarchs would go. But even before that, queens across Europe faced similar plights. Eleanor of Aquitaine's annulment from Louis VII of France, based on consanguinity, cleared the way for her marriage to Henry II of England, profoundly changing the course of European history. So, while marriage was meant to be forever, the power dynamics of medieval royalty sometimes found a loophole, however convoluted. For the Queen, it was a battle fought on legal, moral, and intensely personal grounds, with the very foundation of her life at stake. It was a stark reminder that even the most sacred of bonds could be shattered if the political winds shifted, leaving a queen to pick up the pieces of a life publicly dismantled. It certainly makes you appreciate the relative simplicity of filling out some paperwork, doesn't it? In the deeply religious society of medieval Europe, the lives of queens, like all individuals, were profoundly influenced by the church, and this extended even to their most private realms, often through the role of confessors. These spiritual advisors, usually highly educated and trusted priests, had intimate access to the queen's conscience, offering guidance, hearing confessions, and sometimes, inadvertently, becoming privy to courtly secrets, and even influencing royal decisions. A mainstream historical fact is that confessors held significant moral and spiritual authority over monarchs, often acting as confidants and unofficial counselors. Imagine kneeling in the quiet solemnity of your private chapel, unburdening your soul to your confessor. You might confess not only your spiritual transgressions, but also your anxieties about producing an heir, the loneliness of your marriage, or the political intrigues swirling around you. The confessor was bound by the sacred seal of the confessional, meaning he could not reveal what was said to him. This made him a unique figure in your life, someone to whom you could speak with a level of honesty not afforded to anyone else, not even your husband or closest ladies-in-waiting. A quirky tidbit: some confessors were rumoured to have used their privileged position not just for spiritual guidance, but also to subtly influence royal policy, or advance the interests of their own religious orders or political factions, walking a fine line between spiritual duty and worldly power. It's like having a therapist who also has a direct line to the divine, and occasionally to the throne room. Historians still argue whether the influence of confessors was primarily beneficial, offering spiritual comfort and moral guidance, or if it sometimes led to undue interference in royal affairs, manipulating queens for personal or ecclesiastical gain. The dynamic was complex, relying heavily on the individual character of both the queen and her confessor. A truly pious queen might be deeply swayed by her confessor's counsel, while a more pragmatic one might carefully manage what she revealed. Your confessor might offer advice on fulfilling your conjugal duties, interpreting barrenness as a sign of divine displeasure, or guiding you through the perils of childbirth with prayers and rituals. He would be instrumental in preparing you for religious rites and in comforting you through personal tragedies, such as the death of a child, which was, sadly, all too common. The relationship with your confessor was a delicate balance of power and vulnerability. While you held the temporal power of a queen, he held the keys to your spiritual well-being, a significant authority in a time when eternal salvation was a constant concern. This meant he could, at times, hold considerable sway over your actions, from urging acts of piety and charity to encouraging political stances that aligned with the Church's interests. It's a testament to the pervasive influence of religion that even the most powerful women in the realm sought guidance and absolution in such an intimate way. It makes you wonder what juicy secrets those confessionals could tell if walls could whisper, doesn't it? Probably enough to fill several seasons of a very dramatic historical drama. In the shadowy corners of medieval courts, beyond the pious prayers and religious rituals, there were often whispers of forbidden practices, hinting at queens and the occult. While official doctrine condemned witchcraft and divination, the deep anxieties surrounding succession, power, and personal fate sometimes led even the most devout monarchs to dabble, however secretly, in what was considered magic. A mainstream historical fact is that fear of witchcraft and demonic influence was pervasive in medieval society, leading to severe persecution, yet belief in folk magic and divination persisted, even among the elite. Imagine the pressure you felt as a queen, desperately seeking an heir, or perhaps wishing for the demise of a rival, or simply yearning to know your future. When traditional methods failed, the allure of something more potent, something that promised direct influence over destiny, could be incredibly strong. You might hear hushed rumours of a wise woman in the countryside, or a secretive alchemist capable of crafting charms, foretelling events, or even influencing affections. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval chronicles hint at instances where queens or powerful noblewomen consulted astrologers or even practitioners of necromancy, communication with the dead, to gain insight into future political events or personal fortunes, despite the severe ecclesiastical prohibitions against such practices. It's like asking your royal advisor for a stock tip, but instead of market analysis, you get a star chart and a sacrificed chicken. The line between acceptable religious practice and forbidden magic was often blurry, particularly in the minds of the less educated. Relics, holy water, and blessings were seen as divine interventions, but a misstep could lead to accusations of sorcery. Historians still argue whether accusations of witchcraft against queens or powerful women were often genuine fears of their supernatural power, or simply convenient political tools to discredit and remove inconvenient figures. It was a potent weapon in the political arena, easily wielded against a rival. If you were discovered dabbling in the occult, the consequences would be catastrophic. Accusations of witchcraft could lead to trials, torture, and eventually public execution. Your reputation would be irrevocably stained, and your family, even the king, might disavow you to avoid implication. Therefore, any such ventures would be undertaken with extreme caution and in the deepest secrecy, often through intermediaries who risked their own lives. These weren't necessarily grand, cackling rituals in moonlit forests. It could be as subtle as wearing a supposedly enchanted jewel, consuming a secret herbal concoction, or consulting a fortune teller in disguise. The motivation was often desperate: to secure an heir, to protect a child, to gain influence over a stubborn husband, or to ensure the longevity of a reign. It speaks to the profound sense of powerlessness even queens could feel in certain aspects of their lives, leading them to grasp at any perceived means of control, however dangerous or unorthodox. It certainly makes you appreciate modern-day fortune cookies. Much less risky than consulting a medieval soothsayer, isn't it? And you get a tasty treat too. In a historical period, absolutely fixated on bloodlines, the concept of adoption's royal rarity stands out as a curious anomaly. While commoners might adopt children for various reasons, for medieval royalty, securing a successor by means other than direct biological lineage was almost unheard of, primarily due to the supreme importance placed on legitimate blood ties to the throne. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval European succession laws were overwhelmingly based on primogeniture, inheritance by the eldest legitimate son, making adoption a non-viable path for securing the crown. Imagine the absolute necessity of a biological heir. Your entire queenly existence was geared towards this singular goal. If you, a queen, could not produce a child, or only daughters, the solution wasn't to look for a promising young noble to adopt and declare as your successor. Such an act would be seen as utterly undermining the legitimacy of the royal line, and could easily lead to civil war or challenges from rival claimants to the throne. A quirky tidbit: while formal adoption of an heir was virtually impossible, some monarchs might take in orphan noble children as wards or foster them within the royal household, raising them alongside their own children. These individuals might gain considerable influence and power, but never a direct claim to the throne through adoption. It's like being part of the royal family, but with a very clear asterisk next to your name when it came to succession. Historians still argue whether the absolute adherence to bloodline succession was more a matter of deeply ingrained cultural belief, or if it was a practical necessity to prevent endless disputes and ensure stability in a decentralized feudal system. The concept of royal blood was almost mystical, believed to confer a divine right to rule, and this divine connection couldn't simply be transferred through a legal document. You would have been acutely aware of this unbreakable link between biology and destiny. If you were struggling to conceive, the option of finding an adoptive child would simply not have entered the realm of possibility for securing the succession. Instead, the pressure would mount for annulment, or for your husband to seek an alternative solution, such as a second marriage, often with devastating personal consequences for you. Even if a queen deeply loved a child who was not biologically her own, perhaps a nephew or a foster child, she could never realistically push for that child to inherit the crown. The concept of an adopted heir simply did not compute within the rigid framework of medieval dynastic law and custom. It highlights the profound limitations placed on royal women, whose primary value remained inextricably tied to their reproductive capacity and the purity of the bloodline they brought forth. The idea of choosing your successor from outside your womb was an unthinkable transgression against the very principle of inherited rule. It makes you wonder how many deeply affectionate relationships with non-biological children existed in royal courts, quietly cherished but never acknowledged as anything more than fosterage. A sharp contrast to modern families, where love and connection often transcend biological ties. For a medieval queen, the concept of sexual education's absence was a stark reality. You were often married at a very young age, sometimes barely a teenager, with little or no formal instruction about the physical realities of marriage, intimacy, or reproduction. Instead, knowledge was often gleaned piecemeal from older female relatives, ladies in waiting, or perhaps crude folk wisdom. A mainstream historical fact is that formal education for noblewomen in the Middle Ages focused primarily on piety, domestic management, and courtly etiquette, largely omitting any instruction on sexual matters. Imagine being a young girl, raised in the sheltered environment of a noble household or a convent, suddenly thrust into a political marriage with a much older man. You would have been prepared for the grandeur of the wedding, the responsibilities of managing a vast household, and the importance of producing an heir, but likely left entirely in the dark about the physical means to achieve that last crucial duty. The wedding night, with its expectation of consummation and often public scrutiny, would have been a daunting, perhaps terrifying experience. A quirky tidbit: some medieval marriage manuals, primarily aimed at priests or confessors, contained very basic, often moralistic advice about conjugal duties, but these texts were rarely, if ever, directly consulted by or given to the young royal brides themselves. It's like being given a car and told to drive, but with the manual locked away and only vague instructions from your elderly aunt. The role of imparting any knowledge often fell to your ladies in waiting, who, from their own experiences or observations, might offer whispered advice or practical guidance. This informal education would have been highly variable, depending on the personalities and experiences of the women around you. Historians still argue whether the lack of formal sexual education contributed to difficulties in marital intimacy or conception for medieval royal couples, or if the sheer pressure to produce an heir often overshadowed any personal discomfort or ignorance. Perhaps the constant presence of a duty minimized the need for understanding pleasure. You would have learned through observation, through the experience of childbirth, and through the often blunt discussions surrounding fertility. Your body's functions, particularly menstruation and pregnancy, would be openly discussed by your female attendants, not as private matters, but as vital signs for the future of the dynasty. This constant scrutiny and focus on your reproductive capacity would have been your real education in the physical aspects of womanhood, far more than any formal lesson. This absence of explicit sexual education highlights the instrumental way in which royal women were viewed, as vessels for lineage. Their personal understanding or comfort with their own bodies was secondary to their function. It paints a picture of vulnerability and dependence on others for even the most basic understanding of their own physiology, especially in the context of their most defining role. It makes you realize how much we take for granted today, doesn't it? The simple access to information, even about ourselves, is a modern luxury. No more learning about the birds and the bees from overly zealous midwives and whispers in the palace corridors. Your personal space as a medieval queen was incredibly limited, and nowhere was this more evident than in the constant, intimate presence of the queen's personal servants, particularly your ladies-in-waiting. These women weren't just attendants. They were your constant companions, confidants, and often the only people who witnessed the private moments of your life, from dressing and bathing to the most intimate aspects of your marital existence. A mainstream historical fact is that ladies-in-waiting were typically noblewomen themselves, serving to gain courtly experience, make advantageous connections, and often to provide companionship and personal service to the queen. Imagine never truly being alone. From the moment you woke, your ladies would be there, helping you dress in your elaborate gowns, assisting with your hair, and overseeing your meals. They were privy to every conversation, every letter, every mood swing. This constant proximity meant they knew more about your personal life, your health, and your intimate routines than almost anyone else, sometimes even more than your own husband. A quirky tidbit: some ladies-in-waiting were known to serve as intermediaries in secret affairs, carrying messages or facilitating clandestine meetings, blurring the lines between loyal service and complicity in royal indiscretions. It's like having a team of personal assistants who also double as your spy network and occasional matchmakers, all while helping you put on your corsets. Talk about multitasking. This close relationship could be a source of immense comfort and companionship, especially in a foreign court where you might feel isolated. Your ladies-in-waiting were often your primary source of female camaraderie, sharing gossip, offering advice, and providing emotional support. Historians still argue whether the influence of ladies-in-waiting on a queen's decisions was significant, or if their role was primarily decorative and supportive, with true power residing firmly with the male figures of the court. While they might not openly sway policy, their whispered advice and interpretations of court events could subtly shape the queen's perspectives. However, this intimacy also came with a significant lack of privacy. Your ladies-in-waiting would be present for discussions about your fertility, your menstrual cycles, and even the moments immediately before and after conjugal visits. They would assist with intimate hygiene, help you prepare for childbirth, and be the first to witness the arrival of a new heir. There was no concept of a private moment in the way we understand it today. Your personal life was often a shared experience with your female retinue. The trust you placed in these women was immense, but also precarious. A disgruntled lady-in-waiting could spread damaging rumours, betray secrets, or even become a tool in political machinations against you. Thus, while they were your closest companions, you always had to be mindful of their loyalty, understanding that their own ambitions and allegiances could sometimes diverge from your own. It's a complex dynamic, isn't it? Your most intimate allies also held the power to unravel your carefully constructed public image. It makes you realize how much mental energy would be spent on managing relationships, even with those closest to you. The elaborate and multi-layered nature of royal fashion and modesty in the medieval period was far more than mere adornment. It was a carefully constructed language that both proclaimed your status as queen and dictated the boundaries of acceptable display, particularly concerning your body. While clothing was designed to convey wealth, power, and piety, it also subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, hinted at or concealed aspects of royal intimacy and fertility. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval sumptuary laws dictated what different social classes could wear, with queens and high nobility adorned in the richest fabrics and jewels, signifying their elevated status. Imagine your daily dressing routine. It wasn't a quick affair. Layers of fine linen undergarments would be followed by complex gowns made of silk, velvet, or brocade, often richly embroidered with gold and silver thread. These garments were designed to be modest, covering the body from neck to wrist to ankle, reflecting the prevailing Christian ideals of chastity and decorum. You would rarely, if ever, show bare skin in public. A quirky tidbit: some medieval fashion trends, such as very high waistlines or elaborate stomachers, could also serve the practical purpose of subtly concealing an early pregnancy, allowing a queen to maintain decorum and control the narrative of her fertility until a more opportune moment for announcement. It's like a medieval maternity disguise, allowing you to keep everyone guessing, or perhaps just to avoid unwanted questions until you were ready. While modesty was paramount, certain styles could still emphasize your figure in a way that hinted at your potential for childbearing. The cut of a gown, the way a belt cinched your waist, or the fabric choice could all, in their subtle ways, suggest fertility and health without being overtly revealing. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on modesty in medieval fashion was primarily driven by genuine religious piety, or if it was also a form of social control, reinforcing traditional gender roles and limiting female expression, particularly in the public sphere. Perhaps it was both, a blend of cultural values and practical societal norms. Your hair, too, was a significant part of your public image and modesty. As a married woman, and especially a queen, your hair would almost always be covered, often by elaborate coiffes, veils, or wimples. To show your unbound hair in public would be considered highly immodest, reserved only for unmarried maidens, or perhaps for very private, intimate settings. This covering of the hair was a visual symbol of your marital status and your piety. Every piece of your attire, from the cut of your sleeves to the jewels adorning your neckline, was a message. It proclaimed your lineage, your husband's wealth, and your own virtuous character. But beneath the layers of silk and modesty, your clothes also spoke to the fundamental role of your body, the vessel for the next generation. It was a constant performance of power, piety, and the ever-present promise of an heir, all communicated without uttering a single word. It makes you realize how much unspoken communication happened through fashion, doesn't it? A silent, elaborate ballet of fabric and jewels. In the intricate tapestry of royal lineage, the concept of incest taboos and exceptions played a peculiar and often contradictory role. While the Church vehemently condemned marriage between close relatives, medieval royal families, due to the limited pool of eligible noble spouses, frequently skirted or even directly confronted these prohibitions, leading to complex and often scandalous unions. A mainstream historical fact is that the Catholic Church, over centuries, expanded its definition of prohibited degrees of kinship for marriage, making it increasingly difficult for noble families, particularly those in power, to find suitable marriage partners without falling afoul of these rules. Imagine the dilemma. As a royal family, you sought to consolidate power and wealth within a tight-knit network of aristocratic houses. This often meant marrying cousins, second cousins, or even more distant relatives, simply because they were the most politically advantageous matches. However, the Church considered such unions incestuous, not just in the biblical sense, but often extending to seventh degrees of consanguinity, meaning sharing a common ancestor up to 7 generations back. A quirky tidbit. To bypass these rules, royal families would often seek papal dispensations, essentially a special permission from the Pope to marry within prohibited degrees. These dispensations were expensive and politically charged, often granted in exchange for political favours or significant donations to the Church. It's like getting a special VIP pass for your family tree, but only if you had enough gold and influence. Historians still argue whether the Church's strict rules on consanguinity were primarily driven by genuine moral and theological concerns, or if they were also a clever mechanism to exert control over powerful secular rulers, forcing them to seek papal approval for their most crucial alliances. The ability to grant or withhold these dispensations gave the Pope immense leverage over European monarchs. You, as a queen, might find yourself married to a distant cousin, a union sanctioned by a papal dispensation, but still viewed with a degree of religious scrutiny by some. The fear of divine displeasure, or even physical deformities in offspring, attributed to too close bloodlines, lingered. While these fears were often rooted in superstition rather than scientific understanding of genetics, they were very real anxieties in the medieval mind. The exceptions to these taboos were usually driven by overriding political necessity. When the survival of a dynasty, or the forging of a crucial peace treaty, depended on a marriage between relatives, The church could often be persuaded to grant a dispensation. This created a double standard. For commoners, such unions would be strictly forbidden and perhaps even considered sinful, but for royalty, they could be sanctified by Rome. It highlights the peculiar way power and religion intersected, bending the rules for those at the very top. It certainly puts a new spin on keeping it in the family, doesn't it? Just imagine trying to explain that family tree at a modern family reunion. And this is your third cousin, once removed, who also happens to be your great-aunt's brother-in-law, thanks to a papal dispensation. The delicate balance of Queen's health and fertility was a constant, pressing concern for medieval monarchs and their courts. For you, as a queen, your physical well-being was inextricably linked to your primary duty, the production of healthy heirs. Any illness, any chronic condition, or any perceived weakness could cast a shadow over your ability to fulfill this crucial role, leading to intense scrutiny and often a barrage of questionable medical interventions. A mainstream historical fact is that poor diet, infectious diseases, and limited medical knowledge meant that overall health, especially for women, was generally precarious in the medieval period, impacting fertility and childbirth outcomes. Imagine suffering from a persistent cough or recurring fever. While for a commoner this might be a personal discomfort, for you it would immediately become a matter of state. Physicians would be summoned, exotic remedies prescribed, and prayers offered, all aimed at restoring your vigour and ensuring it didn't impact your capacity for conception. There was a strong belief that a woman's humours needed to be perfectly balanced for successful procreation, and any ailment was seen as a disruption to this delicate equilibrium. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval medical texts suggested that a woman's fertility could be improved by ensuring she had a warm and moist disposition, leading to dietary recommendations that often included rich, heavy foods and spiced wines, sometimes regardless of their actual benefit. It's like being prescribed a steady diet of comfort food, which sounds delightful until you realize it's supposed to make you pregnant. Historians still argue whether the focus on a queen's physical health primarily served her well-being, or if it was predominantly a means to ensure her continued reproductive capability, reducing her to a biological function rather than a complete person. The emphasis was almost always on her ability to bear children, sometimes at the expense of her comfort or long-term health. The constant pressure of pregnancy after pregnancy, often in rapid succession, would take a tremendous toll on your body, regardless of your initial health. You would have been keenly aware that your value, to a large extent, resided in your uterus. If you were perceived as sickly or infertile, your position could become incredibly vulnerable, leading to whispers of annulment or even the king seeking a new wife. This created an enormous incentive to conceal any ailments or discomforts that might suggest a lack of robustness. The pressure to appear healthy and vigorous, even when you felt otherwise, would have been immense. Beyond the specific remedies, your daily life would be managed with an eye towards maintaining your fertility. Your diet, your activities, even your emotional state might be monitored and adjusted by your attendants and physicians, all in the service of producing the longed-for heir. It was a life lived under a microscope, where your physical condition was a public barometer of dynastic strength. It really makes you appreciate the ability to quietly take a sick day, doesn't it? No need for a royal physician to come prod you with a questionable toad ointment. While a medieval queen was expected to bear heirs, the actual feeding and early care of those royal infants were rarely her personal responsibility, leading to the widespread and culturally ingrained practice of wet nursing. From the moment a royal baby was born, it was almost immediately handed over to a wet nurse, a lactating woman specifically hired to breastfeed and care for the newborn. A mainstream historical fact is that wet nursing was a common practice across all social classes in medieval Europe, but it was virtually universal among the aristocracy, including royal families. Imagine the emotional detachment this practice might foster. You, the queen, would endure the perilous ordeal of childbirth, only for your precious newborn to be whisked away, not to your waiting arms, but to those of another woman. This wasn't a sign of indifference, but rather a practical necessity driven by several factors. One key reason was the prevailing belief, often reinforced by physicians, that breastfeeding prolonged a woman's infertility, thus delaying her ability to conceive again. For a queen whose primary duty was to produce multiple heirs, particularly male ones, this was a significant consideration. A quirky tidbit: wet nurses were often chosen with extreme care, not just for their robust health and good character, but also sometimes for their physical resemblance to the royal family, or for having a child of the same gender and similar age, in the quaint belief that this would somehow transmit desirable qualities. It's like a medieval job interview, but instead of a resume, you needed a healthy baby and a strong milk supply. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of wet nurses had a significant impact on the emotional bonding between royal mothers and their children, or if the bonds formed through later interactions and shared experiences were equally strong. While some queens undoubtedly felt a pang of separation, their role was primarily seen as producing an heir, not necessarily raising them in the intimate, hands-on way we might understand today. The wet nurse became the primary caregiver, feeding, comforting, and nurturing the royal infant during its most vulnerable early months. The selection of a wet nurse was a serious affair. She had to be of good health, morally upright, and possess a good temperament, as it was believed that her personal qualities could be passed on through her milk. She would live in the royal nursery, under strict supervision, and her own child might even be sent away or raised by others to ensure her full dedication to the royal infant. The bond between the wet nurse and the royal child could be incredibly strong, often lasting long after infancy, with the wet nurse becoming a trusted figure in the child's life. So, while you endured the pain and danger of childbirth, your intimate connection to your newborn in its earliest days was often mediated by another woman. It was a pragmatic arrangement, driven by dynastic needs and prevailing medical beliefs, but it certainly paints a different picture of royal motherhood than one might initially imagine. It makes you realize how many layers there were to the queen's role, and how even the most natural of human experiences could be shaped by the unique demands of the crown. It puts a whole new meaning on outsourcing, doesn't it? While the medieval focus on heterosexual marriage and procreation was overwhelming, hints and veiled references to homosexuality in hidden corners of royal courts occasionally surface in historical records. Though widely condemned by the Church and rarely openly acknowledged, same-sex relationships, or at least intense same-sex affections, were not entirely absent, existing in the shadows of courtly life. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval Christian theology, influenced by biblical prohibitions and Roman law, largely condemned homosexual acts as sinful, leading to severe social stigma and legal penalties if discovered. Imagine living in a world where your personal desires might be deemed not just immoral, but illegal and punishable by death. For you, as a royal, any deviation from the expected path of marriage and procreation for the sake of the dynasty would be unthinkable to openly pursue. Yet, human nature, with all its complexities, sometimes found expression even within these rigid confines. A quirky tidbit: some medieval chronicles describe intensely close, even passionate, friendships between individuals of the same sex at court, particularly between ladies-in-waiting, where the boundaries between platonic affection and deeper emotional or physical intimacy could be ambiguous to modern eyes. It's like a very intense best friend relationship, but with a lingering question mark over whether it ever crossed the line into something more, all under the ever-present threat of discovery. Historians still argue whether these intense same-sex friendships were purely emotional and intellectual bonds, or if they sometimes masked physical relationships. Direct evidence is scarce, largely because such acts were severely punished and rarely recorded explicitly. When they were, it was usually in the context of accusations, scandal, or condemnation. The risk of exposure for anyone in a same-sex relationship, especially within the highly visible royal court, would have been immense, leading to extreme discretion. You might have witnessed or heard whispers of such relationships, often discussed in hushed tones or referred to with euphemisms. A king might have a male favourite who was rumoured to be more than just a companion, or a queen might have a lady-in-waiting whose devotion seemed unusually fervent. These were often affairs of intense secrecy, existing outside the accepted norms, and if discovered, could lead to accusations of debauchery, moral corruption, or even threats to the legitimate succession. The contrast between the public facade of piety and procreation and the hidden desires of individuals speaks volumes about the human condition. Even in an era of strict religious and social control, personal inclinations, however dangerous, sometimes found expression. It reminds us that history is often far more nuanced and complex than the official narratives suggest, with layers of unspoken realities lurking beneath the surface. It certainly puts a new perspective on courtly intrigue, doesn't it? Beyond the political manoeuvring, there were also deeply personal battles being fought in the shadows. As a medieval queen, your every action, your every appearance was meticulously choreographed to present a specific, the queen's public image. This wasn't about personal authenticity. It was about projecting an idealized vision of piety, virtue, and fertility, essential for maintaining public support, securing dynastic legitimacy, and reinforcing the stability of the realm. Your private life, even your most intimate moments, was ultimately designed to contribute to this carefully constructed facade. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval monarchs, including queens, invested heavily in public display coronations, royal entries into cities, elaborate court ceremonies, all designed to convey power, wealth, and divine favour. Imagine stepping out into the grand hall, adorned in your finest silks and jewels, your expression serene, your posture regal. Every gesture, every glance would be weighed. You were a living symbol of the monarchy, and your appearance had to reflect the highest ideals. This meant constantly performing the role of the dutiful wife, the devout Christian, and most crucially, the fertile mother. A quirky tidbit. To further enhance this image of piety and grace, queens often commissioned illuminated manuscripts depicting them in prayer, or as virtuous figures alongside saints, even if their personal lives were far more complex. It's like a medieval Instagram, but with less duckface and more halo effects, designed to present a perfectly curated version of royal life. Historians still argue whether medieval queens genuinely internalized these idealized roles, or if they were merely skilled performers, expertly navigating the demands of their public persona while maintaining a more complex private self. Perhaps it was a blend of both, where years of performing a role gradually shaped the individual. The pressure to conform to this ideal was immense, especially concerning your body. You were expected to be modest, yet alluring enough to secure the king's affection and ensure procreation. You were to be fertile, yet never appear overtly sexual. It was a tightrope walk over a chasm of public opinion. Even your pregnancies were managed for public consumption. While the early stages might be discreetly hidden, the announcement of a confirmed pregnancy would be a momentous public event, celebrated with Thanksgiving masses and perhaps public processions. The birth of a healthy heir, particularly a son, would be met with widespread jubilation, further cementing your image as a blessed and fruitful queen. Conversely, miscarriages or the birth of sickly children could be publicly mourned, but also sometimes seen as a sign of divine displeasure, potentially damaging your public standing. So, your intimate life, from the dynamics of your bedchamber to the health of your womb, was never truly private. It was a crucial component of your public image, constantly under scrutiny, and carefully managed to present a narrative of dynastic strength and divine favour. It's a stark reminder that even at the pinnacle of power, personal autonomy was often sacrificed for the sake of reputation and the stability of the realm. It certainly makes you appreciate the ability to have a bad hair day in peace, doesn't it? No need for a public parade of perfection. For a medieval queen, the period of post-menopausal royal life brought a significant shift, often a quiet liberation from the relentless pressures that had defined her earlier years. Once past childbearing age, usually understood around the age of 40 or 50, the intense scrutiny over her fertility ceased, and her role within the court could subtly transform, allowing for different forms of power and influence. A mainstream historical fact is that while life expectancy was generally lower in the medieval period, many royal women lived well into their older years, particularly those who survived the perils of childbirth. Imagine reaching this stage of life. The endless cycles of pregnancy, childbirth, and the desperate yearning for heirs were finally behind you. No more questionable aphrodisiacs. No more anxious waits for a missed cycle. No more perilous lying in chambers. This release from biological duty was a profound change, often freeing you to pursue other interests or consolidate a different kind of power. A quirky tidbit. Some older dowager queens, freed from the strictures of producing heirs, became significant patrons of the arts, literature, or religious institutions, leaving a cultural and spiritual legacy that often outshone their earlier reproductive contributions. It's like retiring from the most stressful job imaginable and finally getting to pursue your hobbies, albeit with a royal budget. Historians still argue whether this shift in a queen's role post-menopause truly represented a form of empowerment, or if it simply moved her from one set of societal expectations to another, trading reproductive pressure for matriarchal duties. While you might no longer be a vessel for children, you would become a living embodiment of dynastic wisdom, a seasoned advisor to your son, the king, and a respected elder figure in the court. Your experience, your political acumen honed over decades, and your network of connections could make you an indispensable counselor. You might dedicate more time to religious devotion, to managing your vast dower lands, or to arranging the marriages of your grandchildren. The fear of annulment due to barrenness would be gone, and the double standards of infidelity, while still present, might feel less personally threatening. You could focus on securing your family's legacy through strategic marriages for your children and grandchildren, ensuring the continuation of the dynasty you had helped establish. This phase of life, though less discussed than the dramatic youth of queens, offered a unique dignity. You had fulfilled your most arduous duty, and now you could step into a role defined by experience and wisdom rather than solely by biological function. It was a quieter, perhaps more personally satisfying form of power, allowing you to influence the kingdom from a position of respected seniority. It makes you realize that even for medieval queens, there was life after the biological clock stopped ticking, often a life of newfound purpose and influence. It's like graduating from the Air Producer Academy to the Grand Strategist Academy, which sounds a lot less physically demanding. Ultimately, your life as a medieval queen was a testament to how profoundly a woman's body, particularly her reproductive capacity, dictated her destiny, her power, and her enduring legacy through the bloodline. From the moment of your arranged marriage, often as a young girl, your singular purpose was to ensure the continuation of a dynasty, to secure the future of a kingdom through the children you bore. Your body was not entirely your own. It was a political instrument, a vessel for the next generation, constantly scrutinized, managed, and manipulated to achieve this paramount goal. Imagine your entire existence framed by the anticipation, the struggle, and the triumph or failure of childbirth. Every decision, from the food you ate to the rituals you performed, was ultimately geared towards the health of your womb and the children it might produce. Your personal desires and affections were secondary to the dynastic imperative. A mainstream historical fact is that the success or failure of a queen to produce a male heir could directly lead to civil wars, changes in ruling dynasties, or the absorption of one kingdom by another, demonstrating the colossal impact of her reproductive life. Even in moments of profound intimacy, the shadow of political necessity loomed large. Conjugal duty wasn't just about personal connection. It was about fulfilling a contract, producing legitimate offspring to solidify alliances and guarantee succession. A quirky tidbit: some medieval chronicles, in praising a queen, would explicitly detail the number of children she bore, especially sons, highlighting how this was seen as a key measure of her success and contribution to the realm, almost like a fertility score on her royal report card. It's like your personal achievements were tallied in baby units, which is certainly a unique form of performance review. Historians still argue whether the immense pressure on queens to produce heirs stifled their individual agency and personal development, or if some managed to carve out significant influence and power despite these constraints. While their primary role was defined by their biology, many queens were astute politicians, effective administrators, and powerful cultural figures, wielding influence through their intellect and connections as much as their womb. As you reflect on these lives, you realize that for medieval queens, their bodies were quite literally the foundations of empires. Their pain, their pregnancies, their deliveries, and their children were not just personal experiences, they were the very stuff of history. The lines of succession, the peace treaties, and the power structures of medieval Europe were all woven from the intimate biology of these women. Their legacy wasn't merely in the castles they built or the laws they influenced, but in the very blood that flowed through the veins of future monarchs, securing the continuation of their lineage for centuries to come. It's a powerful, if at times unsettling, reminder of the deep, often hidden connections between the personal and the political in shaping the course of human history. Sweet dreams.